Hey guys, it's me, Halloween Dan, and today I am doing a video where I sort of return to something I've been doing for the last couple of years on and off. And it's something I just like to add to from time to time, though I have to say this may be the last one ever. And this is my characters of horror / characters of Halloween series. That's what we call it. Originally, it was characters of horror, and I talked about Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Mummy, and how they went from being just pure literary characters to cinema characters that now we just kind of think of as Halloween characters, that without them, Halloween wouldn't be what it is. And then recently, I updated the series with a character of Halloween video where I talked about the character of the witch, which although doesn't have a specific story and is in a lot of stories throughout history, the witch has become synonymous with Halloween for so many different reasons and is less a character that Halloween adopted and is more a character that makes Halloween what it is. And we talked briefly not only about witches and witchcraft, but what makes our vision, our sort of stereotype of a witch, what produced that image. So today I thought I'd do a similar thing with another character, but this character is in essence the very character of Halloween, the reason many would say that Halloween even exists. This is the truly spookiest character, the creepiest character, the character that really says more about us as humans than it does anything else. And that character... Damn it! Are you alright?
I'm fine!
I'm just asking. I mean, you fell down. Are you alright?
I said I'm fine! Stop looking at me!
Stop looking at me! Stop looking at me! Okay. I'll stop looking at you. I'm just gonna get back to what I was doing, okay? Okay. And that character is the ghost. So let's do this. Are you sure you're alright? Ghosts, spirits, phantoms, however you refer to them, they are less a character and they are more a part of what makes us human. No matter where you go in the world, whatever culture you stumble across, whichever corner of the globe you visit, you will find ghosts and ghost stories. They are a part of what it is to be a human being. Even ancient cultures that exist outside of the realms of history had some vague belief in afterlife. In fact, it's one of the few things we know about ancient cultures beyond historical texts, that they must have had some vague concept of what an afterlife was because of how they treated their dead. Before recognized and organized religion even existed, people were still treating their dead with respect, not just dumping them in ditches and covering them with a couple of inches of soil, but giving them proper burials. And that tells us something about what they believed was going to happen to that person after they died, because within those burials were often burial goods. These burial goods could be everything from weapons to food to golden trinkets, which suggests that these ancient peoples believed that these grave goods would have a second use, that this person, though dead, their spirit would need certain things in whatever lay beyond, as if their spirit was about to make a new journey to a new place and might need a weapon, might need something to trade, might need something to eat. Some of the earliest texts that we have, which belonged to the ancient Sumerians, who used the first official language that was written into words, their first writings carved out into pieces of clay, were about ghosts and demons and how to deal with them if you were to come across any. This is a deep subject that gets to the core of what it is to be a person. And when it comes to Halloween, well, pretty much the reason that Halloween even exists is because of these ideas. I've talked many times about Halloween's ancient version, Samhain. But in case you've missed the prologue, let me give it to you. Samhain was an ancient festival, mostly in the Celtic world of Western Europe. And what it represented was the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter, celebrated on and around the 31st of October. People would light bonfires and eat harvest meals. The bonfires were to light the darkness for one more time, but they were also to welcome someone else to the feast. And that was the dead. In a very similar way to how they celebrate Day of the Dead in Mexico, the ancient people of both Britain and Ireland and northwestern Europe believed that this night on the 31st of October was the one night of the year where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was at its thinnest, and people from the world of the dead could travel to visit the living again. And they would be welcomed, they were invited, and food was provided for them, and they would share in the banquet. But there was other beliefs as well. Beliefs that along with the good spirits that you were trying to welcome, there could also be some bad ones. So often bonfires would be lit on high hills or peaks or cliffsides nearby to ward off evil spirits. And these protectorate fires were also used to relight the hearths inside people's homes. The belief that that protective fire would keep them safe through the dark winter months. Ghosts, spirits, spooky stuff has been linked to Halloween and Samhain and All Hallows Eve for as long as these feast festivals have existed. And it is the ghost in many ways that is the OG, the original character of Halloween, and in many ways the reason that Halloween exists at all. But that isn't really all we're here to discuss, because what we're also here to discuss is why we think of ghosts the way that we do. Why do we portray them the way that we do? Why do we dress the way we dress when we portray a ghost, a guy in a sheet? Where does that come from? Well, it wasn't always this way. If you were to step back into time and go to, say, the medieval period, and even times before that, their concept of what a spirit or a ghost was completely different to what we think of. They weren't envisaging see-through, ethereal beings that just kind of linger in places. Their idea of a ghost was very, very different. Firstly, ghosts weren't see-through. They were as solid as you or I. But secondly, ghosts were not usually depicted as ordinary people walking around. They were depicted in particular ways. In medieval times, they were often depicted as corpses, basically rotting bodies walking around, possibly still wearing parts of their death shrouds, but generally just as a kind of a corpse, what we would probably think of as a zombie. But even more peculiar, they could also return as creatures, sometimes fantastical, sometimes just ordinary creatures like birds and dogs and cats. And medieval ghosts were always there for a purpose. They weren't just hanging about because of some travesty that happened in their living life, like we kind of think of when we think of ghosts. Usually they were the spirits of the damned, or the semi-damned at least. These were spirits of people who were in limbo, mostly because of something that had happened just before they died. Perhaps they'd been excommunicated by the local priest. Perhaps they hadn't had their last rites read to them before they died. Maybe even worse, they'd been given improper burial. All these things would put the spirit into a state of limbo, and they would come back to the world of the living, whether it be in the form of a corpse or an animal, to try and convince a living person to help them allow their spirit to rest in peace. And usually, if the living person refused, the spirit would haunt them until they themselves died. Nice. Our concept of what a ghost is really doesn't start to formulate until the end of the 1700s and into the Victorian age. And it does so because of technology. The first piece of technology that influenced our idea of how a ghost looks and what a ghost is was a piece of technology we still use in our haunting today, and that's the projector. Invented in the latter years of the 1700s, when the projector first comes into being, it absolutely blows people's minds. This ability to show images of places all around the world projected up onto a solid surface so an entire audience can see them was a completely new and amazing concept. But it didn't take long before some out there, particularly the spiritually sort of more medium side of the world, grabbed hold of this technology and started to use it for their own purposes. And one of these purposes was in a kind of show that became very, very popular across Europe, known as phantasmagoria. These shows had started off simply as a kind of a mediumship show where audiences were encouraged to pay a fee and then they would bring the dead back to visit them. But when the projector came along, this seemed like the perfect technology to aid this, and in a very theatrical way, spirits would be brought back to life, images of spirits projected onto surfaces for the whole audience to see. But at some point, as if to make it even more realistic, these images of demons and ghosts and spirits were projected onto semi-solid surfaces like water, but in particular, smoke. And when an image was projected onto rising smoke, it had two different effects. The first was that it kind of gave the image some movement and made it look like it was a real living thing. But the second was that it created this sort of semi-solid look to them so that they were semi-see-through. And that stuck in people's minds. And so realistic was the effect that half the time these things had to be shut down because it was causing hysteria within the audience. But it definitely put into people's minds the idea that ghosts were not solid, that they had this sort of see-through quality to them. This was later enforced by another very theatrical thing, which is the use of Pepper's Ghost. This is a theatrical device that's used to this day, most famously in the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, where they basically have a large sheet of glass held up at an angle to the audience, and mannequins, whatever you want, are then illuminated from beneath. The reflection is cast onto the glass, and it gives an effect that a ghostly image is moving around in the scene that you can see. This was a device that was first developed in theatres all around the world, where a piece of glass was held in front of the audience at an angle on the stage, and in the sound pit beneath the level of the stage, someone would be dressed as a ghost. The reflection of the ghost was cast onto the glass, and from the audience's perspective, it looked as though an ethereal ghost was on the stage with the actors. This too was incredible to people at the time, and they honestly thought that ghosts were being conjured. But where does the idea of the ghost under the sheet come from? Why do we have that idea stuck in our head? Well, the funny thing is, and I only found this out when I was actually researching this video, there was an actual debate about what it was that ghosts wore. During the middle of the 1800s, as the medium world is starting to grow and more people are going to see mediums, another piece of technology starts to come in, the camera, and sort of prove to people that ghosts are real and that they'd really met their dead uncle or their dead aunt. What would often happen is people would be given photographs of superimposed images of their loved ones over the top of themselves, so it looked as though maybe their great uncle had come to visit. But this sparked a new and unexpected debate, and often people would see these images and go, but why is my uncle wearing a suit that he wore 3 years ago, long before he died? The answer obviously is because that was the only photograph that they had of the guy, and they'd used that photograph to superimpose. But they couldn't say that to the people. They wanted them to believe that this had been a real interaction. So a debate was sparked. What was it that ghosts wore? Did they wear clothes? And if so, why? It seems a peculiar thing to get stuck on by modern standards, but at the same time, it kind of makes a lot of sense. Many started to argue that ghosts probably didn't wear clothes. It didn't make sense that the spirit of a person would die and then move on and also be able to take the clothes they were wearing with them. Did that mean that the clothing had some spiritual quality as well? That the clothing that the person had been wearing had a soul? It started to bring up some pretty deep and interesting questions, and people started to even mock the debate, saying, oh, well, obviously what's happening is that ghosts are going off to the next world, and in the next world there are tailors, there are shoemakers, there are all kinds of people who still do these jobs that we have in the living realm, and people are coming back in clothes. Of course they are. It started a kind of existential crisis within the world of the spiritualists. Were ghosts coming back fully clothed? Or even more worryingly, were they coming back naked?
What?
I mean, the idea of naked ghosts, probably scarier than just the idea of a ghost, right? This debate went back and forth for a series of years where people just couldn't get their head around whether ghosts wore clothes or not, whether ghosts had tailors up in heaven, or whether ghosts took the clothing they wore with them, or all these things. These became very deep questions and threatened to risk the whole spiritualist movement. So, to settle the debate, the spiritualists decided on an answer. The long-winded answer was that spirits could basically project themselves however they wished. If they wanted to show themselves as a child, as their younger version, they could. If they wanted to show themselves as their older version, they could. They could show themselves however they wanted to, from whatever age and period made sense to the person they were showing themselves to. And if they could do that, if they could project the image of their past self onto the world, then they could also imagine themselves wearing clothes. It just made sense. And that the clothing the person would wear was as ingrained into who they were as a person as their very skin. But the second and more simple answer was that ghosts would just be wearing either whatever it was they died in or whatever it was they were buried in. And at that time, the most common thing that most people were buried with was a death shroud. Death shrouds had been commonly used in burials since before time was time. People were often wrapped in sheets or blankets or official death shrouds right through the Victorian period and into the 20th century. So this common piece of universal cloth that was often put with dead bodies became the obvious choice of depiction of a ghost, that a ghost would be wearing its death shrouds, these long gossamer fabrics that gave it this ethereal see-through quality. And that often the death shroud was just a way of giving the spirit form, because by then the idea that spirits were practically see-through and non-existent was very, very common. By the time we get to the 20th and the 21st centuries, our idea of the ghost and the spirit has developed. We know of them in every kind of format, from the classic ghost under a sheet to a girl with dark hair crawling out of a well. We've got the whole bag. We can accept ghosts in almost any form. And in some ways, our understanding of what a ghost is or can be is almost that medieval version where a ghost can be anything from an ethereal being to a zombie-like creature. And yet, when it's Halloween and it's time to dress up as a ghost, there's only one winner. And that's the classic ghost under a sheet, sometimes with eye holes, sometimes with none. It's the image we have, we use it everywhere, it's ubiquitous. Apart from the pumpkin, that symbol of the ghost is pretty much the universal symbol for Halloween and anything that's a bit spooky. And I think it's because although it's spooky, it's somewhat non-threatening. We can accept that version of the ghost. It's almost cute. But the next time you see a little kid running around at Halloween in a sheet and you go, "Oh, how cute," just remember that child is basically wearing a death shroud. Yeah. Anyway, guys, that's it for today. I'm a pretty spiritual person and I do love ghosts and ghost stories. So they're a big part of my Halloween. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about this, as deep as a subject as it is. I could have gone on forever. Everyone knows ghost stories. There's so many ghost stories I could have picked from and talked about. But I just kind of wanted to lay it out there and say, here's what ghosts are, here's what ghosts were, here's why we have them today and why they look the way they look. And I hope some of that information was at least a little bit interesting to you. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching today, and boom, keep it spooky. What he said. Bye.